Hi everyone, my name is Elaine, and today I'm going to be rating Unison League's spawns. Basically, I'm just going to be giving my humble opinion, and I'm going to grade them, like we do in America, because this is America. So, A's to F's, F's to A's, however you want to think of them. No particular order, just stream of consciousness discussing all them spawns. Let's go! Alright, so first up is the Divine Grace spawn. This is very similar to the treasure spawn in the sense that you have a bunch of chests, and you start off paying 15 gems to open the first one, and then there's, the double chance feature if you hit the jackpot, and everything after that initial 15 gem initial spawn is 30 gems. And these spawns, you're just trying to get the jackpot. Usually there's 3 good chests, 3 bad chests. You have some medals that you can earn that you could use to exchange for certain prizes. Usually whatever is featured in the spawn and some other random stuff. And the benefit of the Divine Grace over the treasure spawn is that the spawn itself, so when you're rolling and you're trying to get the URs, the spawn rates for URs are higher than in a treasure spawn, and in other spawns that I think you're guaranteed, all SRs are higher. Whereas you're not in the treasure spawn rolling area. So I do like these spawns because you're, more likely to get URs. But I think that for the most part, like the treasure spawn, these spawns are geared more towards players who have a very large gem pool. Players who spend money on the game. Because you're trying to get the monster usually, which is typically the featured thing in these things, which can take a bunch of rolls just to get from the spawn itself, and usually you need a fair amount of medals to get it if you're doing it via exchange. So having a lot of gems is a necessity in order to do well in these spawns. That's not to say that you can't get other good stuff from these spawns, especially if you're lucky and you hit the jackpot more frequently and not the stuff that are like, the 200 exchange medals or, an awakening orb. If you're a more veteran player after a while, you just don't need those anymore. So I do like that there is a good chance that you're going to get good things, like I said. Do like that there's the medal exchange, which lets you maybe get something that you missed. If, let's say, for whatever reason, on my cleric, I'm always getting lances, which are ever so helpful as a cleric, that sort of thing. That's great. I like that the spin rate spawn section is higher on the drop rate. Don't like the amount of gems you have to spend. Do like that these kinds of spawns do tend to have the better high-end gear. So like in that sense, you're more likely to get good things, but maybe not as many copies as you want for infusions, and you're going to be spending a lot. Even though that's the case, even though you're going to be spending a lot, you might not get exactly what you're looking for, even though you might have to depend on exchanging metals and use tons of gems to get what you need. This is a pretty good spawn by Unison League standards. I'm going to say this basically gets a B plus or so. I think that's fair. Next up is a shared spawn, which is not something that we really see much anymore. It was very popular a few years ago. Basically, you and everyone who does a spawn shares from this pool of, let's say, like 1,000 prizes, and they have, let's say, maybe a featured monster or like a bunch of tickets, and then lesser prizes like proficiency keys or eggs or other augment mats or things like that. And basically, and I didn't get this at first, the goal of this spawn is to spin when the spawn nears the lower end of the pool, so you're more likely to hit that jackpot that's still sitting there at the end of the spawn. And I did like these spawns after I started to figure them out, because I could usually get a good piece of gear. It's just having to sit there and babysit this spawn that was kind of frustrating, because everybody got a life. Like, they don't want to sit there and be like, well, it's at 500. Is this going to be one of those times when like it ticks down really quickly or really slowly, and you're just watching and refreshing and watching and refreshing and trying to just get it at that sweet spot so you can actually get something nice? So that's really the downside. They're not particularly expensive spawns in comparison to some of the other things I'll talk about later, but they're bothersome because you just have to sit there and babysit. So I would say that this is basically like a B, because you can definitely get good things. It's just, do you want to spend your time trying to get good things as opposed to just like spinning it, going through the motion, and then moving on with your life. Next up is the selection or select spawn. These are usually spawns that you get out of packs every once in a while. We get tickets for them, or they'll be featured, and you spend a fair amount of gems to choose, I think it's always from a pool of typically 3 monsters. Sometimes they're more, but basically it's monsters. You get some fancy monsters, you get to pick from 3. You can read all of their abilities and compare them, and then you pick one. And to be honest, I really like these just because, sometimes I don't like the monsters in some of the featured spawn types or the featured monster of another type of spawn. I like getting to pick one that has a design I like. I know it sounds really bad, but I really like the design of certain monsters, and if I'm stuck between two options, I'll always pick the one that looks cooler for me. I think a lot of people might be like that too. And if I'm looking for something specific, I'm more likely to get it with this type of spawn. Let's say if I need a new monster to help recover cost, I'm more likely to get that when I have a few options to choose from, as opposed to when it's like, hey, this is a featured monster of the week. Who knows when the monster type that I need is going to come up again. So for me, this is one of my favorites. The only real downside is that they tend to be more expensive. They tend to be a rare spawn, and you can't pick the stats of the monster. And sometimes you just get unlucky. Sometimes you get the lower end of the pool too. But for me, this is still a good spawn. I'd say it's probably around a B+ for me. It's very solid. If you see them come up, it might be worth doing, especially if you need a monster. Next up are treasure spawns, which I discussed a bit previously when I was talking about Divine Grace. The difference between this one and the Divine Grace, again, being that when you're physically spinning the spawn itself, the spawn rate for URs is much lower. You're more likely to just wind up with a bunch of rares than if you just did the Divine Grace spawn. The things that are great about these spawns is they tend to have the highest end gear, the best shiny new gear in the game when they come out. You know, they're usually 3 good chests, 3 bad chests, if you will. They do have a metal exchange again. Sometimes this is a little different. Actually, when treasure spawns started, I believe they had 9 chests, and this was years ago when I started, and I think they went through a phase where they had 5, and then there are some that are more expensive to spawn where they have 3, and there's usually like 1 good thing, 1 mid-tier thing, and then 1 really bad thing. But again, the benefit of this spawn is you're getting the high-end gear, like the best shiny new things to just like break the game without breaking the game. But again, this is something that you really need a large pool of gems to do and get what you need from the metal exchanges or the spawn itself. And that's really what makes them problematic. This is a very like money hungry type of spawn. And if you don't have that or good luck, which I don't, as we've established many a time, you're out of luck. So this is a higher end, really good spawn, but with some stipulations, kind of like the Divine Grace. This is another thing I'm going to give a B+, I think, even though Divine Grace, you're more likely to get more from the spinning of the spawn itself. Next up are special spawns. These are basically spawns where they're like, hey, here's some featured gear, pay this weird gem amount. It's usually like 15, 25, it depends, at least to start. And they give you some weird prize with it. You get, you know, like a proficiency key or something, and a certain amount of SSRs or URs depending on the type. And there's like a guaranteed from a pool. These are very hit or miss type spawns. You have to be very careful depending on the pool. Like if you go over the pool, sometimes you'll see the spawns where they have a rate of, or a range rather, of like really, really old gear, you know, where it maxes out at 29, but then it goes up to 40. And you have to assume, because this is Unison League, that you're more likely to get the things that are on the lower end of that spectrum than the things that are on the higher end of that spectrum. So they could be good, but they're probably not going to be good. This is just like if you want to fill out your encyclopedia for some reason kind of spawn, or if there's a cosmetic that you really want to go after. Like this isn't a spawn that's really going to, for the most part, help you progress in the game and become stronger. It's just if you're super lucky or you want a cosmetic, there you go. So I'm going to give this like a C- because it's really not that helpful. Next up are collab spawns, and these are basically exactly what they sound like. These are the spawns that pop up during collabs, and they have a few different sections, and there's usually one that guarantees one of the SSRs from the collab, and there's another that guarantees a UR, so you don't have to sit there and do all the augmenting and reforging. I think the appeal for these spawns are just that you get collab gear and people, you know, like collabs because they're usually from an anime that they like and they want something from the anime because, you know, they're fans. But I think these are very overpriced spawns for what you're getting. Usually the gear pieces are high cost, but once the skill converts after the collab itself, it's usually not particularly good. Typically, from what I've heard, the proc rates for these skills on these particular pieces of gear are lower than things you get from other spawns. And, you know, overall, it's really just like, hey, I'm getting an anime gear piece appeal in my Unison League game. Like, that's basically all this is. Or, you know, infusion fodder, if you're into that. There's a chance you'll get a nice shiny new monster. But again, if you're not someone who does very well with spawns, you might not have anything to unlock their potential with because these also tend to be higher end gear pieces. So overall, I would say that this isn't bad. I mean, there is the use of, hey, I'm getting a guaranteed thing. I could probably use it as fodder. I'm getting something that appeals to me because this is from an anime that I like. So I'm not going to give it a terrible grade, but I'm not going to give it a good grade. This is definitely something that's very middle of the road. I'd say like a B-, C+ kind of range for me. Next up are class spawns, which I'm sure you've heard me talk about on the channel before very fondly. Like, these are the spawns that really got me where I am today because they have become so much better than when I started playing the game and it was like, here, pay 30 gems and get one lousy non-infused version of a weapon for your class. Yay. No, class spawns are some of my favorite spawns with some stipulations. So nowadays, class spawns are these things where you pay a lot of gems up front, right? You get to pick one of the banners where it's like, hey, get a weapon guaranteed for the mage, get a weapon guaranteed for the cleric, get a weapon guaranteed for the archer, or, you know, whatever class you need. And then there's also one specifically for armor and clothing, and then there's another one for hats and helmets. But basically, you pay up front, let's say, you know, 120 gems, I think it is now, but you get a guaranteed gear piece for your class that's infused multiple times. Ideally, and this doesn't always happen, you have to be careful, it's infused to the point where you can skill it up to level 6. Sometimes you get lucky and you can skill it up to level 7, and that is the best because when you think about it, these gear pieces might not be top of the line, but when they came out, typically in the treasure spawns and divine grace spawns, these were things that people paid, you know, hundreds of gems for to get maybe just one copy. And now you're getting a multiple infused copy of a gear piece that you could definitely use for your class because I'm assuming you're clicking on the banner that is your class. So you're getting something that can definitely progress you forward when it comes to, you know, your gear score. And you're also getting something that is infused so many times. Typically, again, there are exceptions. There are some tricksy ones where they're only infused like once or twice or even not at all. Multiple times, so you can skill them up to 6 or 7 very easily. And, you know, that increases the rate at which they proc and stuff of that nature, which is always really good. So definitely one of my favorite spawns, an A for me, again, with stipulations. Next up is something called the rare spawn, which you could usually see just chilling in like the far right corner of the spawn area. And it's basically just like this general little spawn where, you know, there are multiple sections. One has one where all appearing SSR are, you know, a certain cost, but it's like a low cost guaranteed. And it's like, all right, probably just gonna get a bunch of low cost ones. There's also like a ×1 version of that, and then someone that are just basically guaranteeing low-end gear, which, you know, if you're a self-respecting player and, you know, you're not just looking for cosmetics, you're gonna outgrow very easily. Like, you don't need 28 cost gear or 30 cost gear max when there's stuff that's 41 cost in the game. I'm just saying, like, save your gems for the good stuff. Even though this is guaranteed and technically you could use it as the expensive version of fodder, it's not worth it. There are better things to be spending your gems on because you're getting higher end gear. So even if you infuse this low end gear that you're guaranteed, you know, and you get this, you know, high end gear from another type of spawn, like that thing without infusions is going to give you a much higher gear score. B probably has a much better skill in effect. Might even have an elemental type that can help with specific, you know, quests. Like, this is just a crap spawn. Like this is just crap. Like, forget this spawn exists. You don't need it. It fails. It is a failure as a spawn. Next up is something called a rates up spawn, which is exactly what it sounds like. It, you know, increases the rates of certain types of gear, usually the UR, and often a specific type of gear. Let's say the ninja specific gear comes up a lot with this one just because they're rare, and I guess people who play ninjas are specifically looking for that. Not a good spawn in my opinion. It's kind of expensive. It doesn't guarantee anything, and honestly, I don't know why you'd want to play a lot of the classes that are featured in this one. I'm not ragging on the ninja, totally ragging on the ninja, very much ragging on the ninja, yeah. But, you know, this spawn is basically like, hey, here's a chance to get more stuff, but it's not good stuff, in my opinion. I mean, if you play a ninja, I guess it could be helpful, because that seems to be what they feature a lot, but, yeah, this one's pretty bad. There's really no benefit to just spinning this as opposed to something else where you probably will get, you know, much higher end gear that will probably help you progress your account a lot better than this spawn ever could. So again, this is just an absolute failure of a spawn. It gets a big fat F. It's a dumpster fire of a spawn. I'm sorry. Not so sorry. Next up are box spawns. These spawns are not very common. Probably came out a few years ago, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And it's basically like, you get this huge box and it's filled with stuff, okay? It's like your mama went out to get you a Christmas present and she just shoved a bunch of stuff in a box, but you have to like pay for your own presents. So like in this giant box with all the presents, there's like, let's say a lance and a staff and a bow and maybe some stuff for the room and then some other random stuff that you definitely don't want, like augment mats, for example, usually something like that. So just like a mixture of bunch of things in a box, and then you basically pay gems to pull stuff out of the box, and chances are you're not going to get the good stuff in the box until the very end of the spawn, because this game is difficult like that and likes to crush your hopes and dreams, and it winds up being a very expensive spawn, and usually you just wind up with some cosmetic things or not quite what you were looking for. So although there is some good stuff in this spawn, they usually have some really cute pieces of gear. You're going to be paying an arm and a leg and maybe a little bit of your soul for that gear. So in that regard, this is a problematic spawn. This is not quite as bad as some of the spawns I discussed recently, but it's definitely not great. It gets like a D because there's some good stuff in there, but you're paying a little too much. Next up is a new spawn called the Redrawable spawn, and this spawn is basically a mixed bag with a bit of a push your luck mechanic. Essentially, you get to spin it after paying some gems, you get 10 items with a guaranteed UR in there of a certain cost. As of right now, at this recording, it's 35, and it goes up to 40, but I'm sure that'll change in the future because, power creep. So the nice thing about this spawn is it does guarantee something, but it doesn't guarantee anything that you might want. So you get to redraw and try again up to 2 times. And this is good because if you don't like what you got, you can try again, but you're not any more likely to get something that you want the second or even the third time around. And obviously, if you spin 3 times, you're stuck with whatever you get at that point. And I mean, that's nice. We've never had this before. We could try again, but because you're not guaranteed anything specific, really, anything that might actually help you, this isn't as good a spawn as it sounds. And especially because the lower cost gear has a higher rate, it's really not as good as it sounds. It's not bad. Like, out of all the things we could possibly spawn, this really isn't that bad, but it's also not as great as it appears on the surface. So overall, I would give this a B. I think it deserves a B. You're guaranteed something that's at least mid-tier. And, if you don't like it, there's a shot you could get something very fancy and shiny, and that's always nice. So there you go. Next up are Stepup spawns, which basically you progress along a series of steps. You pay less at the beginning and more at the end, but as you progress, you get usually, more things associated with the spawn. Let's say like step 1, you get 10 things, but no UR is guaranteed, and maybe you get like a proficiency key. In like step 2, maybe you get to pay 30 gems, but then they have 1 UR guaranteed or something, and then as you go along, like I said, everything gets better. At the end, you're usually guaranteed a featured piece of gear. Sometimes it's like a 50% guarantee. Usually the featured gear is a monster, but sometimes it's a weapon of some sort or defensive gear, and those ones are always cheaper than the ones featuring a monster. So there is a little bit, I wouldn't say controversy necessarily with this type of spawn, but some people really like them, some people really don't. I like them in the sense that, there is a metal exchange, so if you don't get what you want from the spawn directly, there is a chance that you can exchange for the thing you're really looking for and really progress your account that way. The monsters are typically hit or miss, some of them are very, very good. Some of them are a little more mid-tier. Some of them have really great designs, which is something I'm always looking for. But I think the benefit to this spawn, and something that a lot of more veteran players use them for, is definitely just fodder. If you're spending tons of gem on your treasure spawns and your divine grace spawns, this is a good way to get things that you can infuse those higher end monsters and gear pieces with. If not, it's just an easy way to get a fully, unlock potential monster, because you're basically guaranteed them after a certain amount of time. Like, you can count how many gems you need and really plan for this type of spawn a lot better than you can plan for something like a divine grace or a treasure spawn, which is a lot more luck based, and this spawn, which is like, hey, you're definitely going to get this after X point. You can't guarantee that with, treasure spawns and divine grace, because who knows if the universe likes you that day. So for me, even though the stuff that comes out in the spawn might not be as good as what comes out in the treasure spawn or the divine grace, it still has good things that are useful as fodder at the very least. So for me, this is a mid-higher thing. This is definitely like a B minus range for me. It's a very solid spawn, even if it isn't quite as good as something else. Again, the Treasure and Divine Grace spawns. Next up, All SSR Guaranteed Spawns. So these ones are basically exactly what it sounds like. It is a literally spawn that guarantees you get All SSR. It ranges on how many you draw from each round. They're usually very expensive. Sometimes they come with something like a proficiency key. The problem with these spawns, even though it guarantees all SSR, is that the range of gear in these spawns usually starts very, very low, let's say for the point of conversation around 30, and then can go very high to that 40 cost monster, which is really what draws you into them. But the rates for those are so ridiculously low, it's not even funny, and the pool is so large that they might as well not even be in there, because I don't know who's actually drawing them. This is just a bad spawn all around. I don't know why you'd even do this. I guess to get some more recycle metals, because you're basically going to be recycling this junk all the time. It's just too low cost. Like, I don't think it's even helpful for newer players. This is a D. It's good in the sense that you're always guaranteed to get something to recycle, expensive fodder. Maybe you'll get lucky once in a blue moon and get something that's not completely useless, because I think it guarantees that you get at least one item, or rather one item of a certain cost, but usually it's like outdated 35 cost or something not so helpful like that. So again, not a good spawn. Pretty sure I gave it a D before, had a little bit of a brain fart. Just not a good spawn. Next up are elemental spawns, which basically guarantee that you get a gear piece of a certain element, which is good in the context of getting elemental advantage gear, maybe for Mobius or for a more difficult quest, something like that. Usually these gear pieces are, I think, more expensive than they're worth. I don't think the spawn is worth it. Just because, they might not be high cost, but there are ways to get elemental advantage gear without spending gems. Like you could do the Hardeal quest pretty easily, those types of quests, and just get the low end stuff. I mean, you're still getting the elemental advantage. Yeah, your gear score may die a little bit, but in the context of having that elemental advantage, you don't need a high gear score. You're just trying to get an advantage so you don't get mauled by, whatever you're facing. So not a terrible spawn if you desperately need something immediately, and there is a chance that you will get a good gear piece and maybe something that's on class for you, but definitely not my favorite spawn. Definitely not worth the gems in my opinion. This basically gets a D+, just not my favorite. I think the newest spawn we've encountered is something called the Unison Orchestra spawn, because only one's come out at the time of this recording. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I just don't know as much about it as I could. But basically, the spin, so when you're trying to get the UR from the spawn itself, the UR rates are a little higher than the average spawn. I believe they were 10%. So you're more likely to get something from the spawn itself. But there is a very wide pool of stuff. Yes, it featured some really good gear when it came out, but there was such a wide range of stuff that you're probably gonna wind up getting something not so bueno. Benefit is, this is another thing with metal exchanges, but you have to do it so many times to get enough to exchange for something good that it basically winds up being the cost of a treasure spawn or a divine grace spawn. So again, this is something that really, has potential to be good, but you have to spend so much money that it's basically out of reach for the vast majority of the player base, unless they get very lucky. Some of my guildmates got lucky and they got, the featured monster, but I think it's going to be hard to get that with this. So I would basically put this around a C. Yes, it's got some good stuff, a little more than I think the average player can spend or would like to spend just to get one copy of a good piece of gear. Next up are monster spawns, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. You pay some gems, you're guaranteed a monster. Sometimes it has some potential unlocked, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's literally just a monster. Usually it guarantees a certain cost monster, but not always. You really have to be careful with this spawn, because not only doesn't it always guarantee a specific cost, but sometimes it's only, hey, you're getting literally just the monster, so one thing, and it's not always clear with how they mark it, so you have to be careful. Depending on if this spawn has unlocked potentials for the monsters and if it has a decent cost guaranteed, it could be a good spawn, especially if you need a monster, but usually it's not, just because that guaranteed number typically isn't so high. So I guess it would be good for like newer players only, but within a very limited time frame, because there's so many ways to get newer monsters and laden monsters, higher cost monsters, monsters that can really be helpful to a player. Whereas this really doesn't offer that, because like I said, that guaranteed monster cost number is just too low in most cases. So not a terrible spawn, definitely not a great spawn where you could get really lucky but probably won't. I would say that this on average is probably about a C+. Last but not least on my list is the All UR Guaranteed Spawn, which is basically just like the All SSR Guaranteed Spawn, but with URs instead. The benefit to that is that if you're a newer player, you don't have as many resources as someone who's a little more veteran. You don't have to worry about the augmenting and the reforging, which is great. But, you know, if you're someone who doesn't really care about that, wants to fill out your encyclopedia for some reason, this isn't the way to go, because they're already, you know, reforged for you. The problem with this spawn too is that usually it guarantees a certain cost for at least one piece of gear, but that cost is a little outdated by today's standards, so growth potential not so great. The other thing is the pool tends to be very, very wide when it comes to the gear that you could get guaranteed. So it'll start at, let's say, 30 and then go up to like 40. The rates of the lower cost gear are much, much higher than the higher cost gear, so you're probably not going to get anything that's helpful. You might get lucky, but chances are you won't. So this is another spawn that basically fails. I'm going to give it a D, just because I don't have to be bothered with reforges and all that stuff. And there's a chance that I'll get something good. I think the cost guaranteed minimum is a little higher than the All SSR, but not always. You have to be careful. You really have to read the details of the spawn to make sure that you're not getting cheated, if you will. And that's something you should be doing across the board. I know it's not fun, but always read the fine print, because sometimes Unison can get you. And there you have it. That is my rating of all the spawns on Unison League to date. I'm pretty sure I got everything. Let me know down below in the comments if I missed anything. I'm sorry. There's a lot to go over. I hope you guys found this helpful. You know, let me know if you agree with me. Everyone's got a different opinion, and I like to know what those are. And if you like what you saw here today, please smash that like button until it's blue. Subscribe, ring that bell so you'll know what's up, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye, guys.